It's regular order of business to take up and consider Senate Bill 11. Senate Bill 11 puts prayer back in our public schools, and we are a nation and a state built on "In God We Trust." It's above our dais right here. Every desk in this chamber is supposed to have a Bible. It's the same way in the House side as well. And our constitutional free exercise clause is about religious liberties, and this bill expands our religious liberties in our public schools. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, for putting prayer in schools a priority in this chamber and for this legislature. Senate Bill 11 authorizes school districts to adopt a policy to provide for a period of prayer and reading of the Bible or other religious texts during school hours. And in Texas, our schools are not God-free zones. Senate Bill 11 is about providing a space for free expression of our religion in public schools and open enrollment charter schools. The bill does not make participation in prayer or reading of religious texts compulsory. The period provided under this bill does not replace and does not supplant any elective course or classes that a student may take as part of their education. It is simply meant to allow a time for students and faculty to freely express their religion. The bill outlines a framework that school districts may use if they vote to allow a period of prayer and reading of the Bible or other religious texts, which may use to ensure compliance with our state and federal constitutions, as well as any existing case law on the subject. The framework requires that students or faculty who wish to participate in this period of prayer must submit a consent form, and that the period must take place outside of the physical presence and hearing of those for whom consent has not been submitted. But really, what we have to ask is this question: are we better or are we worse off since prayer was taken out of our public schools? And I think we all know the answer to that question. The reality is that when prayer was taken out of our schools, things started to go downhill all over. We know that the cornerstone of a good education is math, reading, science, but character and values matter too. And that's a lot of what we do in this chamber. After all, our children, they spend a lot of their time in our schools, a lot of their lives in our public school buildings. And our schools should never have been God-free zones. And our founders never intended separation of God from government. In fact, the recent Coach Kennedy case debunked the false doctrine of separation of church and state and said simply that you can't be coerced into participating. The Kennedy case made coercion the new test, and Coach Kennedy really has an incredible story of grit and persistence. He was actually an atheist. I don't know if y'all know that. And of course, he was threatened with adverse action for praying on the football field, and it took him 8 years to win that case. Thanks to President Trump, Supreme Court justices, we did. And that was a huge win for the religious liberties, certainly the biggest one in my lifetime, probably in all of our lifetimes. And it comes down to this. In Texas, we're not going to let a group of litigious atheists decide for everyone else whether or not students and educators get to pray. Santa Fe ISD is in my district. That was the last ISD to lose a challenge before the Supreme Court where student prayer was stopped. A few decided for the many, starting in the 1960s and culminating with the Santa Fe case in 2000. And with this bill, we're righting a great wrong of judicial activism. And that wrong extinguished prayer in our public schools. And with this bill, with Senate Bill 11, we are officially putting prayer back in our classrooms in the great state of Texas, where it has always belonged and where we all know in our hearts that it has always belonged. And with that, members, I yield for questions.
Senator Gutierrez, what purpose?
Just a few questions, Mr. President.
Do you yield?
I do.
Mr. President? Mr. President, would you indulge 10 seconds to wish my wife a happy anniversary today? Today's our anniversary. Would you indulge me in those 10 seconds?
Did you want me to wish you a happy anniversary, or do you want to do it?
Well, maybe you could do it too.
How many years?
19 years she's been putting up with me, Mr. President.
She is a saint. You should vote for this bill because a lot of prayer has been with her.
You've only had to deal with me for 4.
I know, and I pray every day, trust me. We celebrate our 50th this year, so I know about 19.
Yes.
Yes, wish your beautiful wife a happy anniversary.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate it. Just a few questions, Mr. President. Thank you, and thank you, Senator. I'm no longer in the doghouse.
It's only 1:40, Senator.
Day left to go. Yeah.
Would you agree with me? Well, I want to take this back here for a little bit because you said something that was interesting to me that I've never heard of in my life before. You said you just said this. Yes. Our founding fathers never intended a separation of church and state. You just said that.
Instead of God from government. Yes, correct.
Never intended it.
Never intended.
Wow. So when they wrote those things in the Constitution, what was that?
So where does it say separation of church and state in the Constitution?
Would you agree with me that John Adams is a founding father?
He is, but let's go back. You said the Constitution. Can you please show me where that's in there?
Hold on, I'm asking the questions. John Adams said, "It is more dreaded than the national government. Nothing," he wrote, "is more dreaded than the national government meddling with religion." That's John Adams. All right? You know that Thomas Jefferson was a deist, right?
His famous letter to the Danbury Baptists. Yes, I'm aware.
Mm-hmm. Matter of fact, during that Revolutionary era, it was a period of decline when it came to religion. The U.S. Constitution makes no reference whatsoever, to answer your question, makes no reference to God as cited in its primary source of authority, not the Word of God, but we the people. Never mentions God in the United States Constitution. Jefferson said that subjected every religious tradition, including his own, to scientific scrutiny. On the subject of religion, Jefferson cautioned his nephew, Peter Carr, "Shake off all the fears and servile prejudice under which weak minds are severely crouched." He urged Carr to question with boldness even the existence of God, because if there be one, he believed in a supreme being, just so you know, he must more approve of the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear. That's what Jefferson said. All right. Thomas Paine, you would argue that Thomas Paine is one of our forefathers, correct?
He was definitely a famous revolutionary time forefather.
He said that he denied that the Almighty ever did communicate anything to man by any mode of speech, in any language, or by any kind of vision. He characterized Christianity as a fable, which for absurdity and extravagance is not exceeded by anything that is to be found in the mythology of ancients. It is, he charged, a book of lies, wickedness, and blasphemy. For what can be greater blasphemy than to ascribe the wickedness of man to the orders of the Almighty? And so, I'm dumbfounded by your comments that our founding fathers never suggested that there be a separation of church and state. As a matter of fact, when you go to the Washington Monument on one of the panels, Thomas Jefferson in his quotes specifically says that the state should not be able to, that we should not infringe on people's religious beliefs, nor should we impose those beliefs on people. And when he said we, he meant government. Does a person include public educators.
I'm sorry.
Person is in your bill.
Well, let me point something out first. So in our Texas Constitution, say Texas, the preamble, it says, humbly invoking the blessings of Almighty God. So to say we're not founded on putting God above all other things is false, totally false. It's right there in our Texas Constitution.
You mentioned the Kennedy decision, but the Kennedy decision didn't supersede or didn't overturn the seminal decision in Engel versus Vitale, did it?
The Kennedy decision overturned the Lemon Test, and it says the Establishment Clause must be interpreted by reference to historical practices and understandings. And this is a free exercise bill at the end of the day. It is a choice.
Right. Well, let me get back to that piece, right? So just from a pragmatic perspective, if parents don't sign off on the permission slip that allows for the moment of meditation, that's how it works, right?
The parents have to opt in, correct. There has to be a consent form, but before even that happens, the school district has to vote their way into it. So before that can even happen.
What are those kids out there that are not opted in, that don't want meditation, that actually want to start math class? What do they do while the other kids are doing their other thing? Do they go into a separate room?
It's up to the school district to adopt the policies around the period of prayer, and they have to work or can work with our Texas Attorney General to determine which of those policies are best for the operation of their particular school district or campus, either one.
Right, and specifically in the Kennedy decision, they argued that the coach, that it was, what he was doing was indeed private and voluntary, and the distinction in our schools, that our kids are captive, right? They're captive in a classroom.
Well, I wouldn't say that. We've got school choice, too, that's hopefully going to pass this session as well.
Well, can the kid move out of the classroom? Can he just go outside in the hallway? No, because he'd get in trouble, right?
When you have to opt in, this is not mandatory.
Okay.
There's nothing mandatory about it.
But you're suggesting that school districts, if half the class opted in and half the class opted out, then the school district has to figure out where those kids take their 1 minute. Is it 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes of meditation?
It's up to each ISD to adopt their particular policy that they have for this period of prayer.
If there are Muslim kids, are we providing prayer mats in our schools? I'm just wondering.
We're not discriminating against any particular faith.
Would you agree with me that students are a captive audience, that while they sit in class, kind of like we are here sometimes?
You could maybe say it that way.
All right. Thank you. Are teachers authority figures?
Typically, but again, it's voluntary. The parents have to consent. This is parental consent. Remember, parental consent.
Would you agree with me that some teachers are very influential over some students?
And I think it's great to have influential teachers. I think we've all been impacted, every single one of us in this chamber, by teachers that have had a positive and a great influence on us.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for that moment of levity.
And a happy anniversary.
Thank you. Appreciate
it. Thank you. Senator Heckenboo, what purpose?
Ask a question, please.
Do you yield? Senator Middleton?
Oh, yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Senator
President.
Heckenboo.
A couple of questions. Just from a non-religious common sense perspective, do you think there's any harm, and it could be some good, in a student be able to take a minute just to bow their head before taking a test?
Well, I think this is very positive for our students, because, we just heard a bunch of arguments here on the floor that this would harm children, but that the pornographic books would not. That's the other way around, right? We had examples earlier today that this is the problem. We're putting prayer in the school, back in the schools is a problem. The pornographic books are not a problem. That's actually the other way around.
And another question about religion. I can't remember the exact quote from Senator Gutierrez, but the way I would interpret that quote was that Adams was talking about keeping church, to stay out of the church, not the opposite. And do you believe that when Thomas Jefferson talked about separation of church and state, he was talking solely about keeping the state out of the church, not the church out of the state?
That's right. So a particular sect would not become one and the same with the government, versus the way that it's been twisted now today is to try to take God out of government completely, regardless of sect.
And one more question. Let me read another quote from John Adams. He said, "Our Constitution was made only for moral and religious people. It was wholly inadequate to the government and any other. When he talks about the moral religious people, do you think possibly school prayer could help build that kind of thing he was talking about?
Absolutely. I mean, this is humbly invoking the blessings of Almighty God, like it says in the preamble to our Texas Constitution. We have to build everything on His foundation, as it says, above the dais right here in this very chamber.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hagenbu.
Senator Eckhart, what purpose?
To ask questions of the author on
Do you
this
yield?
bill.
I do. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Middleton, do you believe that your bill creates religious labeling?
No.
You don't believe that requiring school districts to put this on the ballot doesn't label a school district as religious or not religious?
So you're against elected trustees having to take record votes like we do?
I'm
Is that what you're
asking
saying?
you whether or not you believe that requiring a school district whose mission is to educate, requiring them to put on the ballot whether or not to have this in the schools, does that label a school district as religious or not?
So should we get rid of record votes in this chamber because it labels us?
I am asking you a question, Senator.
No, it doesn't label them. If you're an elected trustee, then you should have to take record votes on policies for your district.
Do you believe that a family who votes against this will be labeled as religious or not religious?
Well, they're not voting against it. They're just not sending in a consent form.
So let's talk about that consent form. Why is it that the consent form requires the parent to waive their rights under the First Amendment?
So it's not created as a litigious vehicle in order to sue the school district because you're voluntarily agreeing to this. It's the same as waivers you sign when you play sports, right? I mean, when you go get on the bus to go to a different venue to compete, similar things.
So if that's the case, why is it that if a parent rescinds their permission, they cannot also rescind their waiver of a right under the First Amendment?
Because the rescission shouldn't be a way to create a litigious position, right? In order, like the atheists here, which are against the bill, American atheists, actually I'm glad to see them opposed. It means I'm on the right side here. To create that challenge, essentially, just as a subterfuge, essentially.
So are you assuming that everyone who would be against, who would not sign this waiver is an atheist?
No, what I'm saying is it's a choice.
So a family that never signs this permission slip still has rights under the First Amendment if their child is coerced in school for religious purposes. But a family that does not sign a permission slip does not have rights to defend their child against religious coercion in school.
You cannot be coerced under any situation.
Really?
Right.
We'll
That's
see
the key holding in Kennedy versus Bremerton. It's
The
coercion.
key holding in Kennedy, actually, was that the individual, the coach, was praying not as a school function, not with a captive audience. And that was the exception, wasn't it?
Well, as you know, it went quite a bit farther than that with the Lemon test.
But that was the holding, that was the fact pattern that underpinned that decision, right?
What led to the litigation over those 8 years that eventually, yes, Coach Kennedy won.
Whereas your bill, unlike the Kennedy decision, requires the school to organize the prayer time, does it not?
It does. It determines up to the school, or it leaves it up to the school to determine what's best during their particular, school schedule and hours to pick what works the best for them.
And isn't that in direct contravention to the Kennedy case's holding.
No, it's not.
Because the Kennedy case said the school was not organizing the coach's prayer, correct?
The Kennedy case spoke to individual liberties, and this is what this does: religious freedoms and free exercise. That's what that case spoke to. That's what this bill does. That's what that consent form allows, is free exercise of the individual's right to exercise their faith.
So are you concerned that parents will have legitimate claims under the First Amendment, and that's why they must waive them in order to take advantage of this prayer time?
No, but it should not be used as a tool by organizations like this, which Madalyn Murray O'Hair is how a very small group of litigious atheists took away prayer for everybody. And obviously
Are aware
that is
that without this bill, students can pray before school, they can pray after school, they can pray at lunchtime, they can pray during recess, they can exchange religious tracts with their fellow classmates, and none of that is prohibited under current law. You're aware of that, right?
That's correct, yes. Yeah.
So why do we need this bill?
This establishes a period of prayer during school hours. What you're talking about is before or after, like the moment of silence, meet me at the pole. That's another good example. There are clubs that meet after school, for example.
So this bill establishes the school organizing prayer.
That's right.
And you don't think that that's a violation of the U.S. Constitution and the Texas Constitution?
No, because there's no such thing as separation of church and state. That was in a letter from Jefferson to the Danbury Baptists that has been twisted completely out of control, and the Coach Kennedy case made that clear.
So you just don't like the Establishment Clause, is what you're saying?
Well, I think you're saying you don't like the Coach Kennedy ruling.
Actually, I find the Kennedy ruling quite solid, and I don't find that your bill comports with it.
Well, it does. We'll have to agree to disagree.
But you just don't believe that the Establishment Clause should be enforced?
Because they changed their lens. That was the old test, Establishment Clause. Now the test is free exercise. In other words, it was looked at harshly, like the endorsement test is now gone, right? That's gone.
So have you reviewed any of the debates leading up to the U.S. Constitution and the Establishment Clause?
Actually, there was a very famous one at the Constitutional Convention where things were not going very well. And Ben Franklin said, you know what, we need to begin our day in prayer. This is really not going too well. And then when they did that, things started to go well. So yes, I have reviewed the history.
I pray every day, Senator Middleton. So your assertion that someone against your bill is not religious could be seen as very offensive. Do you see that?
I don't think it's our position to decide for everybody, as those atheists did in the 1960s. A small group decided for every Texan and every Texas child and public school and educator, you don't get the right to pray during school hours.
Now, I agree with you on that. I agree that a small minority should not be the arbiter of the very personal religious pursuits of everyone else. I completely agree with you on that. And in the debates leading up to the writing and the passage of the U.S. Constitution, the New England members of the Constitutional Congress argued for a religious test. You're aware of that, right?
Sounds very familiar. I don't have the passage you've got in front of me.
And the Federalists denounced it, saying that a religious test would go directly against the bulwark of religious liberty. That in order to assure religious liberty, we were to do everything we could to avoid religious tests and religious labeling in the United States. You're aware of that, right? You're a lawyer.
This is not a religious test, if that's what you're referring to. It is not. That's the Abington case, I think, that you're referring to. And students were compelled to participate in prayer and Bible reading. And this bill doesn't do anything of the sort. It allows the school district to choose, and then after that, allows the parent to choose, and of course, the educators and students as well. So,
But if a parent does not choose or rescinds the choice, so if a parent does not choose, they still have the right to defend their child against coercion by a school-organized prayer time. But if they do opt in or rescind having opted in, they have signed away their right under the First Amendment. Isn't that true?
they haven't signed away their right. They've signed away their right to sue the school district for damages for something that they agreed to. And this bill contemplates this by prohibiting prayer, for example, over a loudspeaker, right? Where there's no way you can tell if everyone's consented or not consented. And it prohibits that in the bill specifically, that is not an acceptable method to implement this. But then it also goes on and to say that they need to work with or should work with the Attorney General in developing this policy to make sure that it is voluntary, right? I mean, I think you support that it's voluntary. You agree with that?
I would absolutely agree with the idea that there is no religion worth respect that isn't come to humbly and individually without coercion by the state. Thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Senator Hancock, for what purpose?
That's after a few questions.
Do you yield?
I yield. Thank you, Mr. President.
Yes, Senator Middleton, are you familiar with a case that's very similar that was recently discussed, Birdville ISD versus one of their students that sued the school?
Yes, yeah.
You're familiar with that case from 2015? It's where I served for 13 years, and actually my brother was on the board when this case took place, where a former student, along with the American Humanist Association, actually sued the district. Are you aware of what they sued them for?
I don't recall the pleadings on it.
Well, they actually happened to start their school board meetings with prayer from student-led. In other words, organized by the school district, with students invited to come and lead before the school board meeting started in prayer. And they were sued over that by a former student. Now, we've kind of talked about whether school districts could organize and have voluntary prayer. And in an issue in the court case, how the coach's case is, spoke against that. Are you aware what the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in this case?
I don't recall the holding.
So they actually ruled with the district. They ruled with the district that they could have organized prayer before their school board meetings, led by voluntary students leading in those prayers. Now, that opinion was appealed, the Fifth Circuit was, to the Supreme Court. Do you know what happened at that point?
Fortunately.
The Supreme Court did not pick it up. They left it. So we do have a court ruling intact, where I served for a long time, where my brother was on the board when this case took place, where the Fifth Circuit actually ruled that this school district, Birdville ISD, could organize prayer before a school board meeting, have students volunteer to pray at those meetings, not coerced, just a voluntary prayer, which I know it's not exactly the way your bill's laid out, but there is a court ruling here in the state of Texas that's pretty darn close to what you're trying to actually put in statute through SB11. Would you agree?
That's right. Because the way it is right now is most children in our public schools and faculty as well, so educators, they don't have the opportunity to pray out loud during school hours. No one's making anyone do anything. We're giving them this opportunity with this legislation.
You know how proud I am to be a part of that district?
You should be.
I'm glad that we, for years, have led and started seeking wisdom before we ever had a school board meeting, and I'm glad they won the case. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Hancock.
Thank you, Senator Hancock. Senator Menendez, what purpose?
Thank you, Mr. President. Questions of the author?
Do you yield?
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Mr. President.
Here we go. Thank you, Sir Milton. Sir Milton, my understanding is the bill as written only specifies, it only names the Bible as the only religious text specifically named. Is that correct?
It says or other religious texts.
Pardon me?
It says or other religious
Or other,
texts. Yeah.
yes, but it only refers to the Bible or other religious texts,
Right,
correct?
Right.
Okay, so would the school districts, if they voted affirmatively, would they be allowed to specifically name other religious texts as well?
The bill doesn't discriminate. It's not prescriptive.
Okay. You're aware there's approximately 5.4 million Texas children in our public schools?
5.4 million, it's a lot.
5.4 million. And obviously, of those 5.4 million, not all of them are Christian, correct?
Correct.
Very likely that throughout the state of Texas, we have, children who may be Muslim, Sikh, Jewish, Buddhist, Native American, Hindu, or maybe not of any particular faith. Would that be correct? Safe to assume?
Sure. Yes, correct.
So my concern, you may be aware that I've worked for a long time on bullying issues in this building. And one of my concerns is, how are we going to ensure that students, how will the schools ensure they're not peer pressured, bullied, otherwise coerced? I mean, your bill takes out the word encourage. It takes that out. Encourage, some could call it encourage, some could call it coerce by their friends, classmates, coaches, or a teacher to participate in prayers or to get a signed consent form. So aren't you concerned that teachers would face additional pressures in addition to trying to teach the students, to try to get them the best scores, to try to get them to come? Are you not concerned with potential bullying related to a student potentially sitting out voluntary prayer without potentially making inappropriate comments regarding religion?
Our laws against bullying still apply. This bill doesn't change that at all. What I'm saying is students and educators deserve the opportunity to pray if they want to. And we as a body and as the legislature should not say, we're not going to trust you to exercise your religious liberties. We're not going to let you freely exercise your faith. But this bill changes that. This bill changes that, thanks to the Coach Kennedy case.
But don't we already, we already passed the Texas Religious Freedom Rights Bill Act, and so people already have the right to pray, don't they?
Not out loud during school as part of school hours. That's something that's really not happening in our public schools right now. You're talking about what Senator Eckhart was talking about earlier, which is meet me at the poll prior to school hours, the moment of silence, these other things that were sort of a way to try to, with the old case holdings before the Coach Kennedy case, before Carson v. Macon, before the Espinoza case, to basically not get sued by this group of American atheists to go after every school district that wants to let students participate in prayer. I mean, this is that's why that's happening. Because these out-of-state groups with out-of-state money are suing our Texas school districts.
A few weeks ago, we passed, I think y'all call it an education savings amendment bill that had a lot of out-of-state money and interest involved as well. My question is, why was the word encourage removed from the list? It says here, the list says a person may not require, encourage or coerce a student to engage or refrain from such school prayer or meditation during school activity. For some reason, the word encourage is taken out in your bill, and I'm just curious, what was the purpose of that?
That was put there with the old Lemon test, right? And so the Lemon test was thrown out in the Coach Kennedy case. And that was the old, Establishment Clause test that Scalia had a bunch of bad things to say about, and rightfully so. And I'd be very, very happy to have that and know that that's gone and not there anymore.
So an example, what do you have an example of what would be permissible under encouragement? What would be, because I guess the question is, how is a teacher going to know the difference between proper encouragement and coercion? How is And then what if the teacher feels they were just being encouraging, but the student felt coerced? Who gets to discern between those two?
Well, at the end of the day, that student has to go back to their parent and get them to sign that consent form. So this is parental consent, right? The parent has a lot of input in that. We've done a lot of legislation in this chamber to put more tools back in the hands of parents, and that's who that rests with that parental consent.
But once they've signed the consent form, did they also signed away rights, did they not?
To sue under that claim, yes.
Okay. So the parents, let's say the parents sign the consent form, maybe because any concerns or questions about whether, let's say we have a coach who says, everybody who plays for me has to have, Tom Landry was famous for his t-shirt that says God, family, team, something like that. And I'm just curious, what if the coach is telling everybody, what if the student feels that if they don't participate, they may lose their spot on the team? Does that concern you at all?
That's definitely coercion.
That's coercion?
That if you said, look, we're not putting you on the team if you don't pray, that's coercion.
Sir, I understand that you have very deeply held beliefs, and there's nothing I'm going to say to change that, and I don't expect to, and I would never try to. I just feel a very deep concern for the students who may feel an additional pressure on top of all the other pressures they're already going through when we're asking them to perform better, to get the best scores they can, and to show up. And I just think that we're making matters a little more complicated because, like we said here many times before, that there are certain things, and wouldn't you agree with me, we've talked about, there are certain things that we want parents to teach their children. We don't want the school necessarily teaching them about sex, right? That's something we've discussed in the past, is that correct?
Yes.
So then maybe something as important as our faith is to many of us is something that we would want our families and our parents to be focused on, and maybe not the school. And that's the concern that I have. Thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just to clarify a matter, Senator Middleton, in discussing this bill, I don't recall.
Do you yield for questions?
I do.
You're recognized.
Sorry.
Thank you. I want to clarify one thing. I think it was an exchange with Senator Gutierrez. You mentioned, I don't think you used a partisan term, but that somehow some members had it backwards, that it was okay to have porn in schools, but not okay to have prayer in schools. I want to make sure that you don't really mean that, because it's true that no one on this floor expressed any support for any obscene material in any school, and that for anyone to say otherwise would be a lie. Do you agree with that characterization?
Well, when you're saying this bill is harmful, but that we need to let pornography in schools, what else are you saying? I mean...
Oh, no one said, you heard several members say that they oppose obscenity, pornography, and any similar materials in schools. No one said it's okay. The only thing you heard from any member was that if there's a question, it should go to the courts, not the legislature. Do you agree with that?
A question should go to the courts. It depends on if there's a challenge. I guess that's what you're referring to. But that actually came up with the chaplain's bill last session, where they said, or the Ten Commandments bill, actually, sorry, it was Senator King's bill, that it was unchristian and un-American to display the Ten Commandments, but it was no problem to have these things like this. I don't know where the book is here. I put it in the desk because it was so bad that the Lieutenant Governor waved earlier, that are so inappropriate, and that's not the real danger, and the real danger is the Ten Commandments in classrooms. That's ridiculous.
That bill's coming up, Senator.
Again and again and again. It's not okay.
Right, okay.
It's not
so
okay.
Are you going to say that I or Senator Gutierrez or Senator Menendez or Senator Eckert said that it's okay to put obscene materials in schools?
Did you vote for the bill?
I asked you a question. Did you hear me say that today on this floor? Or did you hear me say exactly the opposite?
Different bill, different subject, but voting no on that bill says, hey, we want to make it easier to have obscene materials.
Okay, so if you make that statement, I'm going to say that you're lying to the public. Next, on this bill in particular.
Let's keep it to questions. Okay, we're not making political comments. It's time for questions.
I understand, Mr. President. I wanted to make sure that it was a question about how he viewed our comments, but I appreciate we're going to talk about the bill here.
That was a fair question. The comment after was not.
Okay, thank you, sir. From reading the bill, it looks like you're not going to require school districts to eat up class time if they do provide a time for prayer, out loud prayer and reading of the Bible and other religious texts, right?
Right, so it doesn't replace instructional time.
Would that result in an extended school day?
It could be a few more minutes. I wasn't around when prayer was allowed. A few on this floor were. From my understanding, it wasn't very long, but that was a really important part of the day, even though it wasn't very long.
You know, I remember a session or two ago, I introduced what at the time was called an SEL bill. It was a social and emotional learning bill, and I think we changed the names because people were kind of nervous about those terms. We had a bipartisan agreement that there is a need in the classrooms for kids to be aware of their emotions, to be able to manage their emotions. But I'll tell you that in the course of the debate in committee, several members brought up the idea, actually the old familiar phrase that education is supposed to be about the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. It wasn't 4. It wasn't reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion, right?
The core of a great education is reading and math.
And writing.
And writing.
Okay, but now we have, as a fundamental part of our education, a space for religion. You know, because the conversation I heard around that SEL bill was all this other stuff you learn at home, in your private world. Isn't that what we ought to do with religion too?
It is the home that's deciding whether or not the child participates. The parents are deciding.
But they're not learning it at home. They'll be doing it at school, right?
They're choosing to participate.
I don't want to belabor the point, but I think you're expanding the role of our public education system to include matters that particularly conservatives have previously said is a private matter. And now I don't need to make a statement on the bill because that was kind of a statement. But thank you for indulging me.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Senator Campbell, you are recognized. Where's Senator Campbell? Right there, right behind Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to ask the author of the bill questions.
Do you yield?
I yield, yes, thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I do believe that prayer in school should be an essential part of the student life of every school in America. Thank you for bringing this bill. The question that I have, does SB11 prescribe any official prayer?
No, it does not. Thank you,
Is there anything in the bill that forces students to come together and form prayer groups around any individual beliefs, or does it just give freedom of students to pray in the school for a brief moment or study the Bible in a short period of time based on their own beliefs without interference of any official capacity, any official representative of school?
Right, there's nothing mandated or prescribed that requires a student to do anything under this bill, actually.
It gives them the freedom, if they want to pray or read the Bible without interference, being stopped, interference by any official of the school or government.
That's correct. Thank you.
Would you say that this bill supports that government was meant to be out of the churches, but God was never meant to be out of the government?
That's 100% correct.
That came from Tony Evans.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
The motion is on suspension. Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Bardwell.
23 ayes, 7 nays. The motion is suspended. Chair lays out in second reading Senate Bill 11. Secretary, read the caption.
Senate Bill 11, relating to a period of prayer and reading of the Bible or other religious text in public schools.
You're welcome for passage to engrossment.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I move passage to engrossment for Senate Bill 11.
When ready, the Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Bardwell, Blanco.
23 ayes and 7 nays. The bill passed to engrossment. You're now recognized to suspend the constitutional 3-day rule.
So moved, Mr. President.
Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Cardwell.
24 ayes, 6 nays. The constitutional 3 days is suspended. Chair lays out on third reading and final passage Senate Bill 11. Secretary, read the caption.
Senate Bill 11, relating to a period of prayer and reading of the Bible or other religious text in public schools.
You are recognized on final passage.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I move final passage for Senate Bill 11.
Secretary, call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Bardwell.
23 ayes, 7 nays. Bill's finally passed. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.